Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Goes Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if appeasement had continued? Now I want to give a shout out to Caitlin's Country Balls. I probably pronounced that wrong, but this is a YouTuber, quite a small YouTuber and stuff, right? But a while ago we had this discussion and we were going to do a collaboration on this because he does those little country ball things, right? But anyway, it was, for various different reasons we weren't able to do it. However, I did say that I would give a shout out to his channel, so definitely hit the subscribe button for that, right? But what this video is going to be looking at is what would have happened if Britain and France had continued appeasement and basically, not declared war on Germany, right? So that's what the premise of this video is. But before we obviously get into all that, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't. Remember, we're trying to hit 2,000 subs by Christmas, so we can definitely do it. I've seen the numbers rising. It's been getting better, it's much better. Rising up, back on my feet. Did my time, tip my chance. Anyway, back to the point. So now we're talking about the serious history of it. So, first of all, we have to start with World War One. So World War One obviously happened and Germany ended up losing that. And so as a consequence of that, you end up having the Versailles Treaty, right? The Treaty of Versailles, whatever. And within that, it was a thing where every other country was able to self-determine, right? So they were able to basically draw their borders based on what made sense in terms of what ethnicity lives where, right? Apart from the Germans. So the Germans were not able to do this, right? So within the Treaty of Versailles, first of all, the Rhineland was going to be under military occupation from the Allies, and so they weren't able to remilitarize like the Rhineland. Then on top of that, you had a ban on the Anschluss with Austria, so Germany and Austria couldn't unite even though both those people are Germans. On top of that, you obviously had Sudetenland, which was basically in Czechoslovakia, which had 3 million ethnic Germans there. They weren't able to join in as well. And then on top of that, you also had many Germans who lived in Poland as well, right? But the Polish corridor had basically been carved out so that Poland had access to the sea, and the port city of Danzig, which is now Gdansk, that was made into a free city, right? So although the population there was 98% German, it was said that, right, the Germans and the Poles can have access to this, right? And something like, I think 55% of their exports and 60% of their imports, of Poland's imports and exports, came through that port, right? So kind of gives you an idea of just how central it was, right? But anyway, fast forward now, and you obviously have the rise of Hitler. So Hitler obviously in Mein Kampf had laid out he wanted to do a Drang nach Osten, which is a drive for the east. He wanted basically Lebensraum, which is, taking a living space from like the ethnic Slavs and stuff, right? So invading Poland, invading eventually the Soviet Union, and using that land for a German settlement, right? So that was the plan of Hitler from the very, very beginning, way before he got into power. So now he got into power, how serious was he in terms of pushing through this policy? Now, in order to answer that question, first of all, we have to look at this not from a Western perspective, which what we're kind of used to, but more from an Eastern perspective, right? So first of all, we have to kind of bear in mind that, Germany and Poland end up having a non-aggression pact, right, from quite early on. So the reason for that is because Poland is sandwiched in between Germany on the one hand and the Soviet Union. And obviously at the time of Poland's independence, right, it fought the Polish-Soviet War, which was very destructive, where the Soviet Union tried to basically retake Poland from them. So Poland was very, very worried about like this threat from the east, the kind of communists taking over. So they formed a non-aggression pact, right? And there was even talk of Poland joining the anti-Comintern pact, right? So this was with Germany, Italy, Hungary, etc., right? So the plan was that all these countries were going to come together and basically form a kind of a defensive and eventually an offensive organization, right? To basically stand up against the Soviet Union and eventually to invade the Soviet Union. So this was kind of the plan all along. However, Poland didn't end up joining this pact for many different reasons, but mainly it was to do with the fact of they couldn't agree with the Germans as to how and what was going to be carved up from the Soviet Union. So obviously both the Germans and the Poles wanted territory in Ukraine, because obviously Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, it's very fertile land, etc., etc. And also as well with regard to the Caucasus, which is further south, that's where all of Russia's oil is, right? 86% of the Soviet Union's oil, it was produced in the Caucasus. So there's a big debate about, are the Germans going to have it? Are the Poles going to have it? Etc., etc. And because the talks on that kind of broke down, that's why Poland never joined the Comintern. But they were very, very close to actually joining it. As we've covered in our previous videos surrounding World War II, right? So, for instance, we've had what if Britain and France invaded Nazi Germany? We've had what if Hitler never declared war on the USA, etc., etc., right? So we've got lots of videos on that. So definitely check those out once you've seen this one. But in that, we kind of cover the fact of, so the policy of appeasement was largely to do with the fact of Britain and France didn't want to fight another war, right? So obviously they'd lost many, many people like in the First World War, and people both in terms of the elites and also like the general population were very skeptical about going to war. And so the policy of appeasement, both when it was, the Rhineland, then when it was the Anschluss with Austria, then when it was the Sudeten crisis, people were very much in favour of being like, okay, cool, just let the Germans be themselves and just whatever. Like, the Treaty of Versailles was a bit too harsh anyway, so we have to basically just, okay, let's just undo Versailles basically and just kind of let them do whatever, right? So from a strategic standpoint, from a public relations standpoint as well, it made sense to basically have appeasement, right? And as we covered in our video about what if Britain and France, invaded Nazi Germany, as we can see in terms of the statistics when it comes to like the rearmament, right? By 1939, Germany was spending more than twice as much on defence than Britain was. I still haven't been able to find the statistics for France, but as we know within our own timeline, in 1940, a full year after 1939, of course, right? Germany was able to beat Britain, France, the Low Countries, Denmark and Norway, all within the space of a few months within that summer, right? So we know from our own timeline that Germany was able to do that, and so there's nothing to suggest that in 1939 Britain and France were not really prepared to fight Nazi Germany, right? So maybe it made sense for them to just look the other way when Germany invaded Poland. So we're going to get onto the invasion of Poland, and we're going to look at some of the wider things within that now. So first of all, obviously, with regard to the declaration of war against Germany because they invaded Poland, what we have to kind of think of is, okay, why did we decide to go to war because of Poland, right? So first of all, Czechoslovakia was a liberal democracy. It had a long-standing kind of alliance with France and with Britain, right? And yet we kind of just threw them under the bus, right? Meanwhile, Poland was a military dictatorship, and it had also passed some anti-Semitic laws as well, right? Obviously not as bad as Nazi Germany, but still, it was a thing where the case for us going to war to defend Poland was much weaker than it would have been for Czechoslovakia, and yet still we decided to do that. Why was that? Well, obviously, as we've said before, in terms of appeasement, it made sense from a national interest kind of standpoint, because obviously, people both in Britain and France, they'd seen what had happened in World War One, and they'd seen millions of people who had died in that war, and so they wanted to avoid that, and so they weren't in a big rush to kind of go into a second World War, right? So at all costs, they thought, right, let's just keep staving this off. Okay, cool. So the Germans, the Versailles Treaty is bad anyway. Let's just kind of throw it out anyway, whatever. Because in terms of Germans not be able to remilitarize their own territory, Germans not be able to unite with other Germans, let's just look the other way for this, right? However, when it came to the invasion of Poland, because Germany had already taken the rest of Czechoslovakia, so not just the state land, they'd taken the whole of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, this was seen as a break from promise, right, that Hitler had made, that there would be no more territorial ambitions, right? So invasion of Poland was more just a fact of, right, you've already broken the promise with regards to Czechoslovakia, we can't trust you, and also we need to set an example to you, right? Because what you have to understand, as we covered in our other videos as well, is this whole thing of the balance of power, right? Certainly for Britain, they've always seen this in terms of on the continent. you never want to have one power becoming too dominant, right? So whether it's France, whether it's Germany, whether it's whoever, right? You always form alliances with the smaller countries, right, in order to resist your like major big rival, right? So whichever country is most dominant on the continent, that's the one that Britain is always going to ally itself against, right? So obviously, although there's this kind of dragged Nat Austin, it still is a thing where Britain goes, okay, if Germany goes east, if they take Poland, if they invade the Soviet Union and take like a lot of territory in the Soviet Union, what's going to end up happening is that Germany is going to have all these resources, all this land, right? And then they're going to be a massive threat to us. So it's better now to make a stand against them, right? So it's kind of a big gamble, really. So they're like, right, if we declare war on Germany, right, over the invasion of Poland, Hitler's going to just back off and he's going to like just be like, okay, cool. But the problem is that through appeasing Hitler all those times before, Hitler ended up having a lot of like a derision. He ended up having a lot of contempt for the Western powers. So he was like, they haven't done anything up to this point. Why are we going to listen to them now, right? Surely, like, they're not serious people, right? So we don't have to like listen to them. So when it came to the invasion of Poland, right? So obviously they invaded on like the 1st of September, right, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declares war on Germany. But then on the Western Front, nothing happened until the next year when the Germans actually were the ones who were on the offensive, right? But in terms of Poland, right, so obviously Poland's been attacked from the west by Germany. But then on the 17th of September, they end up being attacked by the Soviets, right? Now, why was that? Well, that's because a few weeks earlier, in late August, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right, which was an alliance, between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, right? So the reason for that is because, so from Stalin's perspective, like he was like, okay, we want to basically expand a bit of territory and stuff, and also use that as kind of a buffer because we know that the Germans are coming, but we want as much land in between us and them as possible, right? So that's part of the reason for that. And then from the German perspective, there was like, okay, right, if we do this deal with the Russians, then we can like purchase some Russian oil as well, and some food, etc., etc. So it's kind of a win-win situation. And also as well, we get a free hand in dividing up Eastern Europe. So that was basically the overall plan. Now, there ended up being a second part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, which came a little bit later. And this basically, there was a few little changes with regard to this, right? So the Soviet Union, originally had wanted to take Estonia, Latvia, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia, which later became Moldova, and then also as well, with regard to some territory from the Finns and stuff. But obviously, because of the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, the Soviets ended up getting humiliated by the Finns. They did end up taking that territory, but it was a huge humiliation. It showed just how weak the Soviet army was after the purges of the late 30s. But anyway, in this second thing, it was to do mainly with who would occupy Lithuania, right? So, in the second one, the Soviets end up taking Lithuania. And the Germans weren't necessarily too happy with this, right? But they kind of end up going, okay, fine, you guys can kind of take this, right? The thing is, now the Soviet Union had a bit of an issue, right? Because first of all, whereas before, when you had your own borders and stuff, right? You had all these fortifications, you had all these defenses there, right? Now you've advanced further away. Now your defenses there are not going to be as strong. And on top of that, you've got rid of all these buffer states which are in between you and Nazi Germany, right? So while it was kind of buying time, and while it was kind of seen as a thing of, okay, we're creating more of a buffer for ourselves, in actual fact, all it's kind of doing is making it so instead of the Germans being far away from you, now they're right on your border. And the reason why Stalin decided to do this is because it actually has come out much later and stuff, right? But he was actually planning on doing a preemptive strike against the Germans, right? At the point at which he thought the Germans might come and attack the Soviet Union. So that's why he kind of was, expanding territory, right? And he was like, okay, cool, we are going to now go and attack Germany. So we want to be as close to the Germans as possible so we can do this preemptive strike. Now, the thing is, what Stalin didn't really take into consideration, right, is Hitler was fanatic and obviously he wanted to drive to the east. And he always saw the thing with Britain and France and stuff as kind of a sideshow, right? As much as we kind of centralised the Anglo-German part of the war, for Hitler, Britain was small potatoes, right? And it's kind of just a distraction because obviously he always wanted to go to the east, right? So Stalin never thought that Hitler would do a two-front war, right? So he never expected, while Germany is still at war with Britain, surely not going to be stupid enough to attack the Soviet Union, right? So that was what Stalin's big misjudgment was, right? So because he was waiting to do this like big offensive, right? He hadn't really built up the defenses along the new German-Soviet border, right? And because he was like, well, this attack of the Germans is never going to come because they're still at war with England, right? Because of that, he wasn't prepared to do this preemptive strike at this point. And so what ended up happening is Germany had time and was like, right, okay, bang. And in June of 1941, that's when Operation Barbarossa happened. This is the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans. Now, the thing to note about World War II is this, right? As much as us in the West, we try to like centralize it and make it all about us, in reality, 88% of German casualties throughout the entire war took place on the Eastern Front. So obviously, this is the Soviet Union, and the Soviet people. They are the ones who defeated Nazi Germany. We helped, but it was done with their like soldiers, and it was done by their people, right? So realistically, World War II was won by the Soviets, right? Which is not a very popular thing, and obviously in the comment section we're going to get loads of Americans being like, blah, blah, blah. But within this video I'm going to explain that a little bit more, right? So within this, there's 3 different scenarios, so like basically, so obviously as we've said, Hitler's invaded Poland, right? Britain and France haven't declared war on Germany, they stay out of it, right? So at this point now, Germany has got no reason to strike west, and has got no reason to strike north, right? So Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, France, that they're all fine, right? So there's no blitz, there's no battle of the Atlantic, there's none of all that stuff, right? Britain and France just stay out of it, right? So the question is, would Hitler have invaded the Soviet Union in 1940? This is a big kind of debate. I don't think, based on what I've kind of seen, right? So the first like proper plans for Barbarossa didn't take place until October 1940, right? And the plans were for the next summer, so 1941, for that to have taken place. So as much as people kind of might think, oh, like the war in like the West kind of like slowed things down, I don't think so, because Germany needed more time to build up, and also as well they needed to consolidate the gains that they'd already made, right? So I don't think they would have just invaded Poland and then like the next summer gone straight and invaded the Soviet Union, right? So more likely than not, the invasion of the Soviet Union still would have taken place in the summer of 1941. Maybe it would have been changed by a few months by the fact of like, Britain ended up sending troops to Greece and and there was all the kind of things going on in the Balkans. And so that slowed them down a little bit by maybe a few weeks or maybe a few months. But it wasn't a major thing, right? And so, the problem with like a lot of British people is that they kind of centralise it and they don't realise that they were kind of the sideshows, right? So everything happened in North Africa, all these kind of things. It's not really until the last year of the war, like the last 12 months of the war, so from like basically D-Day up until like VE Day, right? It's only at that point when like the British and the Americans play a big part. So within this timeline here, Operation Barbarossa has happened, right? And so we're going to have 3 different scenarios. One in which the British and French completely stay out of it and just let the Germans and the Russians like do their thing, right? The second in which Britain and France, and by extension to a more limited extent the United States, support Russia, right? So not by sending troops and stuff, but like through military aid and stuff, right? So basically lend-lease. And the third one is one in which basically the British and the French, and by extension perhaps the Americans, give their support to Nazi Germany. Now, for a lot of people, that last one might seem completely improbable, right? So we're going to address that one first, right? So first of all, we have to like bear in mind the fact of the leaders of Britain and France, and also America as well, were staunchly anti-communist. Churchill, at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, said that communism ought to be strangled in its cradle. So from the very outset of like the Bolsheviks taking over, they had always wanted to like get rid of them. And Hitler, like in the early days, was seen as a thing of, okay, right, he's at least going to be a bulwark against the spread of communism, right? So a strong Germany is going to be a good defense against communism. So it's not completely unfeasible. I'd say it's unlikely, but it's not completely unfeasible for them to basically jump on the bandwagon and be like, right, cool, like let's let's help Germany completely destroy the only communist country in the world. So it's not, we can't completely rule it out. However, I don't think it's necessarily that likely. I also don't think it's likely that America would have actually got involved. So within our own timeline, America only got involved because like Hitler declared war on them, and before that, in terms of Lend-Lease, that was because Britain was on its last legs, right? So although American public opinion, at the time of 1939 and stuff, right, although they tended to be in favour of Lend-Lease and just supporting Britain and France because of the invasion of Poland, it wasn't a thing where they wanted to send troops in, right? So they might have given some military aid, but I don't think they would have really got that involved, right? And in terms of for the Soviet Union, yes, the American public and the American establishment were anti-Soviet, but they were really big into isolationism at this point. So I think if there's no Battle of the Atlantic, if Britain's not on its last legs, if there's no urgency to kind of get involved in this, I think the Americans would have just sat this one out completely. Britain and France, they might have helped the Nazi Germany in this thing, but again, I think it's quite unlikely, and I think they probably would have been like, well, just let just let them kind of get on with it, right? The second thing, which I think is probably more likely, is that Britain and France support the Soviet Union through basically Lend-Lease, right? Again, I don't think that the Americans would have got involved in this because, again, the whole thing of isolationism. But I can see this timeline happening a little bit more, whereby they're like, well, we don't want Russia to completely collapse in, yeah, and for the Germans to completely take over, right? So this kind of support the Soviet Union in their struggle against the Germans, right? And then hopefully the Germans will be weakened enough, and then they won't be a threat anymore. So I think that's probably a more likely one. The third one is the case in which Britain and France completely stays out of it and just goes and sits back and just does nothing at all and doesn't help either side. Now, in this case here, this is where it becomes very interesting because it's like, okay, so the Germans obviously put a lot of troops into the Eastern Front, right? About 80% of the army was sent to the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942. However, something to note is that obviously, well, first of all, obviously Germany would have had some troops within itself, right, just to protect its own borders, etc., etc. But there was a large contingent of that remaining 20% who were stationed in France, who were stationed in Holland, who were stationed in Norway, etc., etc., right? So this was obviously to stop the British from being able to land on the continent again, right? So in our own timeline, there was the Atlantic Wall, and obviously it fluctuated in terms of how many troops were there based on what year and what level of threat there was. So when the Americans ended up joining and D-Day, the prelude to D-Day, you end up having obviously more troops kind of being put there. But in the early days in 1940, 1941, it was unlikely that the British were going to be able to land there, so there was less troops, right? But certainly there was hundreds of thousands of German troops stationed in Western Europe, right? World War II, in a way to think about it, is it's kind of a war in two or maybe three parts, right? In which, the first phase of the war, which is basically the Anglo-French German War, right? That's basically over by the summer of 1940. So within that, Britain and France lost that part of the war, right? So it's a thing where the Germans obviously had troops there and stuff, right? But if they hadn't wasted the troops in the taking over of France and stuff, if they didn't need to worry about Britain and France being a major threat, if they could focus maybe, let's say, 90%, 95% of the German army into the Eastern Front, would those extra men and those extra resources have been enough to have turned the tide in the war on the Eastern Front? Now, based on the research I've seen, and obviously there's a debate amongst historians, etc., etc., but based on the research that I've seen, I can't see a situation whereby the Soviet Union ends up losing that war. Or actually, it depends what one defines as losing. Certainly, Stalin wouldn't have had a peace deal with Hitler at this early stage, especially with the Germans being so far into the Soviet Union. I made a separate video about what if Stalin made a separate peace with Hitler, but the timeline for that is one in which the Soviets have kicked the Germans out, and that's in 1944, and it's well, okay, the Germans have got no chance here anyway, we'll just make a peace with them. So definitely check that video out as well, because that video, well, obviously it's brilliant anyway. But yeah, so that video is it covers that element to it. But if it's 1941 or 1942 and the Germans are still deep within Russian territory, and obviously they're committing all of these war crimes against like the POWs and basically committing acts of genocide against the Soviet people, I can't see a situation in which Stalin just goes, yeah, okay, cool, we'll cut our losses here, right? Because the German aim in Barbarossa was to reach the so-called AA line, right? So this is Archangel in the north, all the way down to Astrakhan in the south, like kind of where the Caspian Sea is. So they had no illusions that they would be able to take over the whole of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was absolutely massive. But what they wanted to do is get to this line because they would have taken the Caucasus, they would have taken the Ukraine, they would have taken Moscow, they would have taken Leningrad, etc. So by taking all of this, you end up having the bulk of the Soviet Union's population, the bulk of its resources, the bulk of its like oil, its food, etc., etc. And so the capability of the Soviets to continue that war after that point, it would have been greatly diminished. However, I don't think that would have been decisive enough because I think that, the Soviet Union was much more determined, and much stronger than the Germans anticipated. And so I think that, in the same way that they moved their factories and stuff, like further east, into Siberia and to Central Asia, I think that basically the Soviets would just move further east and then just had a war of attrition, wearing down the Germans over the years, right? Even if it went on into the late 40s, even if it went on to 1950 and perhaps beyond, I think that the Soviets would have continued this struggle, both in terms of like the frontline war and also the war behind German lines, like with the partisans. So I don't really see a situation in which there's a peace at any point, and I think that the German army would have been worn down over the following years, right? So even though they've got all this territory, it's easier said than done. And this is what we kind of covered in the video about, what if Napoleon never invaded Russia. As we saw with that, taking Moscow doesn't finish off the Russians, right? I know that 1941 is not the same as 1912, but in 1912, the Russians burnt down Moscow. So by the time that the French end up taking it, there was just like ruins, right? So I don't see why in 1941, with the kind of Battle of Moscow, because the Germans were literally at the gates, right? If they had had a few extra men that they would have otherwise had in France and all these other places, right, and they'd been able to push and take Moscow, I don't think that would have stopped the Soviets. I think they would have just continued on the fight. And the same thing with Stalingrad. Yes, it was a decisive battle in terms of destroying the German army, and it was a huge psychological impact for them. But I think that if the Russians had lost Stalingrad, I think they could have continued fighting and probably would have. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. So now we're kind of talking about, the Soviets eventually pushing back the Germans further and further. So how does the West react in this time now when the Germans are on the retreat? Now, before we're talking about how the war on the Eastern Front comes to its conclusion, right, I'm going to do a quick detour over to the Pacific, right, just because obviously it's World War II, everything has an effect on other things, right? So, first of all, obviously, Japan wanted to expand further, both north and south, right? So, ideally, what it wanted to do was to take Siberia. Then also, obviously, it was already in China, and then also wanted to take the resources of Southeast Asia, right? Now, in 1939, the Soviet Union had already defeated the Japanese army in Manchuria, and so the army was kind of put on the back foot. And then also as well, Japan was suffering from an oil embargo, right? So they were short on oil, so the Navy ended up taking prominence and with their so-called Southern strategy, right? Now, why was there an oil embargo, right? There was an oil embargo because America put an oil embargo on Japan. And Japan had this oil embargo put on it because it had occupied French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, right? Now, the reason why they did this, and the reason why later on they went south into Malaysia and into what now is Indonesia, which was owned by the Dutch, the reason why they did all that is because they were basically opportunists, right? And so they saw that the Europeans were distracted with obviously what was going on there. And so they was like, right, okay, we can take these colonies and no one's going to stop us, right? Now, in this timeline, the question is, basically, how insane are the Japanese, right? Because if they were like how they were in our timeline, right, they would basically have tried to attack all these places, tried to conquer all this land, but if Britain and France are not in a war, and if Holland has not been occupied as well, right, you're going to have the full force of the British, French, Dutch and American Empire all brought to bear on Japan, right? So the war in the Pacific would be over very, very quickly, possibly by 1943, or 1944 at the latest, right? So all the Western powers would gang up on Japan and defeat them there, right? Now, if Japan was a bit savvier and didn't decide to attack all these countries, then I don't know exactly how the war in the Pacific kind of like turns out. Maybe it's just a prolonged Sino-Japanese war where they just stay in China for many years and continue the fight there. So there's lots of eventualities with that. There's lots of different like alternative like paths that could take down. So I just want to mention that, but obviously there's a lot of things to kind of take in consideration with that, right? So don't want to just focus purely on Europe because what happens there has wider impacts for the rest of World War II. But now obviously we are back in Europe and we're talking about this is maybe 1944, 1945, 1948, 1949, whenever this war like kind of like between the Soviets and the Germans starts to draw to a close, what does Britain and France do at this point? Because you have to think, obviously, they've had an extra, I don't know, 5 years, an extra 10 years, yeah, in order to build up their armaments, right? And Germany in this time would obviously be weakened after having been fighting the Soviets all this time. So maybe what happens is the British and French go, right, we don't want Russian troops on the Rhine, right? We don't want them all the way on like the border between France and Germany. So before they get anywhere near that, we're going to preemptively attack Germany from the west, and we're gonna like take, well, all of what end up becoming West Germany, like maybe push all the way to Berlin, maybe push like to the Oder River, whatever it ends up being, right? Now, obviously, there's all kinds of complications with that in terms of like how the Soviets would end up feeling. Yeah, like would they be happy that Germany end up being crushed in this thing anyway, or would they be embittered at the fact of like, you know, the British and French kind of sat like back and like just ate popcorn throughout the war, and then at the last moment like came in and stole the glory? It's very complicated, and it's like, how does the Cold War kind of like, maybe this is the start of the Cold War in this context, right? But the thing is, in this whole video, I want people in the comment section to be debating this here, right? From a purely national interest standpoint, right? Did it make sense for Britain and France to declare war on Germany either in 1939 or at all? Because obviously there's a moral argument for fighting Hitler. But the thing is, did it make much sense? Because obviously France ended up being completely occupied by the Germans. They were completely humiliated. This obviously ended up leading eventually to the downfall of like the French and British empires, right? And obviously Britain was bankrupted during this time and ended up becoming very indebted to the Americans and having like US troops in Britain, etc., etc. All these kind of things, right? So did it necessarily make sense for Britain and France to declare war on Nazi Germany? Or should they have just like stayed out of it and let Hitler push forward to the east? Obviously, as we say for all of our videos, this would never have happened. Because obviously, as we said before with the balance of power thing, they would never have just allowed this to happen. But still, that's where the debate is. So, if you enjoyed that video, obviously don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe as well. Like we said, 2,000 subs by Christmas. That's what we're aiming for. Also as well, hit us up on Instagram. That's where we have our merchandise as well. So definitely, you know, we're going to do a big sale for Christmas as well. We're also going to expand it as well to like beanie hats as well, like tracksuit bottoms, like kind of jackets, like kind of like hooded jackets, etc. So what you see on there already, that's what we're going to be selling, but we're also going to be selling some other things as well. So definitely stay tuned for all that stuff. And the next video is going to be on what if William Jennings Bryan end up becoming the president. Many of you may never have heard of him, but he was a very important politician around the turn of the last century. And basically, if he had ended up becoming the president, a lot of things would have obviously changed, right? Obviously, that's why we're doing the video. But anyway, with all of that being said, have a great day and bye.